Hi, everybody. Let's dive into lesson 24. As we do that, let's look at today's vocabulary word. Today's vocabulary word is morphology. Morphology is the physical appearance, structure, characteristics, traits. Any of those words could be substituted for the word morphology. Let's look at an example of the word morphology in a sentence. The long tusks that are a part of an elephant's morphology serve several important functions. We could substitute that into another we could substitute another phrase into there and it would still make sense. The long tusks that are part of an elephant's physical appearance, the long tusks that are part of an elephant's physical characteristics serve several important functions. We'll see this word again today as we go through the slides. So what we did, remember back in lesson 23, is we developed an explanation as to why the Junco stayed at the university campus when it was built. Part of it is because the university campus created an environment separate from the surrounding scrubland where the organisms could access resources that they couldn't find in the surrounding scrubland, almost creating an urban island in the scrubland surrounding area. So let's go into what we're going to talk about today. Now that these populations are separate, living in separate areas of the country, we need to look at how else these two populations have changed since they split apart. So in this lesson, we watched some sections of a video, and in there, the scientists connected some parts of the physiology or the morphology of the birds with certain behavior traits. The behaviors that we know exist within the campus birds are that they are more bold, they are less aggressive, they are better parents, they have less extra pair mating, and they have higher song frequency. It means they sing at a higher pitch. This is tied to two pieces of their physiology. They produce less corticosterone, that stress hormone, and they have lower levels of testosterone. So as part of our exploration, we're going to link their morphology, their physical features, to the behaviors. So there are 4 questions we can ask. Which of these physical traits did scientists claim were connected to certain behavioral traits? What sort of behavior traits do you think might be connected to lower testosterone production? Which traits seem like they would give the Juncos a competitive advantage for finding a mate? Which traits seem like they would give the Juncos a competitive advantage for raising more offspring? In the video clips, the scientists told us that the lower levels of the stress hormone would help the birds to be more bold or less shy. It may also help them be less aggressive. Having low corticosterone levels can sort of help them be better parents because if they're less stressed and they have shorter flight initiation distances, they're less likely to leave their nests abandoned, which protects their babies and keeps them properly incubated. We can also say that testosterone would be a physical trait that could be connected to behaviors such as less aggression, less extramare pairing. What sort of behavior traits do you think might be connected to lower testosterone production? We sort of talked about that. So lower testosterone, which is a hormone which drives them towards mating, would mean less extra pair mating. So you're going to have males and females staying together. It's also going to drive them to be less aggressive. Testosterone can lead to aggression in animals. Question 3, which traits would give the Juncos a competitive advantage for finding a mate? Higher song frequency would be a behavior that would lead the birds to having an advantage. As a higher pitch sound would be able to travel and be heard by the other birds over the lower frequency sounds of humans and human activities, like car engines. Which traits seem like they could give the juncos a competitive advantage for raising more offspring? By having less extra pair mating, they're spending less time mating and more time with their mate, meaning they have more time in the breeding season to mate and raise broods of offspring. So it's less competition, less trying to find a mate and going through all of that, and they already have their mate. Another thing would be being less aggression and being better parents would definitely give them a competitive advantage for raising more offspring. Not only are they going to be able to raise more broods of offspring, but their offspring are going to have higher rates of survival as they're more attentive to their offspring and spend less time doing other things and pursuing more mating. So let's try and make this make some sense. We're going to ask the question, looking back to knowing our 4 steps of natural selection, how could natural selection have changed the population over the last 60 years so that there's now a higher proportion of individuals that have traits that give them a competitive advantage for producing more offspring in the college environment than there were before? So you're going to refer back to specific traits that we identified on the first page that granted them a competitive advantage. So what are some of those traits that competitive advantage? Being bolder, for example. Being bolder allows them to access more food and water resources and to find more nesting places. Another trait that would be advantageous for producing more offspring would be the longer breeding season and raising more broods. That's advantageous because the more broods you can raise, the more that your offspring are likely to survive. Another trait that's advantageous is being a better parent. More birds that are more attentive to their offspring, their offspring will have higher rates of survival, which is really important because the only way for traits to pass on is for the organisms to survive, to be able to reproduce. So if you can raise your offspring to adulthood, then they're more likely to then be able to reproduce and pass on the traits that you gave them. They can now give those traits on to their offspring. So let's look at some of the physical traits that we talked about way back at the beginning. Let's talk about those wings for a second. What advantage could juncos with smaller wings have compared to juncos with larger wings? And what advantage could juncos with larger wings have compared to those with smaller wings, considering the two environments they have to survive in and migrate between? The way I like to think of this question is a comparison between a fighter jet and a 747. If we think about a fighter jet is a much smaller plane with smaller wings. And what are fighter jets really designed for? They're designed for maneuverability. They're designed to be able to move and swerve and turn in sharp places, go close to structures, be able to survive. I think of the campus Juncos as the fighter jet Juncos. Those smaller wings enable them to maneuver more around those obstacles. For example, humans, or sides of buildings, or around trees, or swerving of the way of vehicles. The mountain Juncos remind me of the 747 Juncos. By having larger wings, they're going to be able to glide more on the air currents. It's going to take them less energy in order to fly. So they're going to be better for migrating those long distances without becoming too exhausted. They're going to be able to migrate back and forth to the mountain. But they're not going to be able to maneuver quite as well on the campus. What this also means for those little fighter jet Juncos on the campus is that with those shorter wings, they would have a much harder time migrating back and forth to the Mount Laguna campus. So these differences in wing lengths would definitely, for the campus Juncos, keep them from being able to migrate back to the Mount Laguna environment. Another way that these two groups of birds are different and that these differences keep them apart. So, if we put this all together, what's the important thing that we need to know about natural selection and evolution? What we need to know is that some traits give advantages for being able to produce offspring and reproduction, and other traits are important for the survival of the individual organism. Again, species want to do two things. An organism wants to survive, and an organism wants to reproduce. These are the two driving forces of just about every organism. For natural selection to operate on a heritable trait in a population, the individuals have to survive long enough. If I, as a parent bird, produce offspring, but my offspring don't survive into adulthood, then it was all for naught. The traits that I pass to my offspring will not pass on. If my offspring don't survive, then neither does my species. Neither does my population. And the last important thing is that physical, behavioral, and physiological or morphological traits are often interconnected. So sometimes natural selection operates on one, and it also affects others. As physical traits, for example, brain chemistry between the birds were different, it affected their behavior as well. And as their behavior led them to do certain things, meant that certain physical traits were now an advantage. And so one connects to the other, and all together, natural selection that affects one aspect can also affect the others as well. Kind of a domino effect. So on our scientist timeline, what is some stuff that we can add to it? The important thing that we need to know is that these birds are separated, and they're separated by geography. The birds with their shorter wings are kind of stuck at the campus. Now, it's okay because they're adapted to survive well at the campus, but they're not going to be able to interact with the mountain breeding juncos during the breeding season because the mountain breeding juncos, they're up on the mountain, hundreds of miles away. The campus breeding birds, they're still at the campus. So there's a physical separation during the breeding season, meaning that these two populations are not going to breed with one another. This is a really important piece. So the question we want to ask is it possible that something like this has happened at other times in the past? Are there other juncos out there besides these two? Well, how do we go ahead and answer this question? How would we do that? One way I can think of is by looking at other junco populations in the similar way that we have looked at the mountain juncos and the campus juncos. That's going to take us into lesson 25, where we're going to explore and make our model even bigger. Besides talking about the Mount Laguna and the campus juncos, we're going to start looking at other species of juncos and to see how related or how unrelated these juncos are, and what are some of the behavioral, physiological, brain chemistry, and behavior traits that separate these different species. And what are some other things that separate them as well?